With us. Jason has been our teacher, our guide all the way through, and we appreciate him being here so much. He is the editor of the monthly publication, The Christian Courier, and all week we've learned from him about how we can trust God, and I really have appreciated that, how we can trust His Word. And then we've also learned that the theory of evolution is indeed a theory, and it is not fact. And I read at one point that it doesn't even qualify to be a theory, that in fact it is only a hypothesis. And I've always appreciated what the writer had to say. I want to push the Christian Courier just for a little bit. For those of you who love challenging Bible studies, I would recommend it. The church will be having 12 copies a month placed on a resource center. You may take them. They'll be free. For those of you who would like to have it in your home, just fill out one of the forms back here. They will be sent to you free of charge, and they'll be glad to do that. Some of the topics I wanted to hit very quickly, just so you can get a little bit of an overview of some of the studies that you will have. In June of 23, be strong in the Lord, a mindset for Christians. Homosexual marriage in the Bible. Your adversary, Satan, the devil. Arm yourself with the mind of Christ. And some of the other articles through time have been, can a Christian walk away from God? A study of worship. The Christian and bribery. Of course, Bible ethics. The elder's duty of watchfulness. The amazing unity of the Scriptures. 6 reasons why prayers are never answered. What does the Bible say about angels? There are other challenging topics, and we're so glad Jason is here with us. Thank you.
It's great to be with you again tonight. I appreciate your encouragement. I appreciate your presence and your support overall of this VBS that really is doing a great service for all of these kids. And we can suppose that all the teachers and all those behind the scenes who are making this possible are in some ways looking forward to tomorrow. They're probably pretty tired at this point. And it's really great to see people pitch in and have such a wonderful event like this. And like I said Monday night, we're just here along for the ride, and I appreciate you being a part of this class and thinking about the same topics that our kids are covering and hopefully being encouraged along the way as well. The topic assigned for tonight is human evolution, or as I like to frame it, as you see on the chart, should we believe the biblical account of creation? And I'm going to emphasize this evening that the biblical account of creation goes beyond just some vague mention that God is behind it all. That the biblical account of creation actually includes details about how God created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. And so we'll be thinking about that tonight, and that, of course, is contrasted with the theory of evolution, or Darwinism, as it's popularly known. So should we believe the biblical account, the details in the Bible about creation? I mentioned the other night that in 2015 I visited the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and this is one of those random pictures that I took along the way. And you can see for yourself the kind of area in the museum that this was dedicated to. Come meet your relatives. Well, we've probably known some people that we would wonder about in all of that, but the Bible presents an entirely different picture regarding human beings and where they came from. This is a statement, as you know, that suggests all of us are descended from lower life forms, from primates or apes, and then really all the way back to that single cell organism that just came to life out of nowhere. But the Bible, in the details about creation, is very explicit that we are not descended from anything, but are a unique creation. We're not related to anything other than each other. And animals themselves are not related to each other. And by that we're meaning the basic kinds of animals. We know there's variation within certain kinds, and as much as we may wonder about how all of that happens, we know that a Chihuahua is related to a Great Dane. Hard to figure that out, but it's still a dog. And yet there are genetic barriers that are not crossed in our world. And God created certain kinds. And according to the Genesis record of creation, we're not related to any of them. And things reproduce according to the fixed genetic code God gave to each kind. But this is what our children are going to be fed. That we are descended from in a natural way, in a process that is completely natural, God unneeded, from all of these previous life forms. And I had this, and I want to emphasize a different part of it. You remember this was the quotation on a wall that says, "What is geologic time?" Scientists refer to the vast stretches of Earth's 4.6 billion year history as geologic time. This is in the same museum. It's hard to grasp, yet essential for understanding evolution. To have evolution, you got to have this time. But here's the sentence I want to emphasize tonight. I should have underlined it instead of the other one, but big changes happen through small steps over the course of geologic time, that is, the billions of years. What do they mean by big changes? Well, something becomes something else. So a certain living organism completely changes into something else and something more complex, some higher type of living organism or more complex. And how does this happen? So big changes means things are evolving into things that they are not. This process from the single-celled organism to man. An ape becomes a human being. Big changes. How does it happen? Through small steps. That's a description of evolution. Well, what are those small steps that result in something changing into something else that it was not? That's a part of an ongoing debate, even among evolutionists. I have a book with me tonight written by Dr. Jeff Miller from Apologetics Press. Jeff holds a PhD from Auburn University in mechanical engineering. He is thoroughly prepared to discuss from a scientific vantage point all of these matters. And he discusses in detail the alleged mechanics, the small changes that create these small steps that create the big changes. And in so doing, it's interesting that in chapter 8 he talks about the evolution of evolution. Because the theory that once was is not the theory that is today. And so the theory itself changes, but the common denominator through time is that we don't need God. We can explain it through some kind of natural process. But we'll talk about what these so-called small steps are and how the small steps have been redefined, or different kind of small steps have been advanced through the years. So anyway, again, we're supposedly able to see these small steps and big changes in the Earth's rocks and fossils. We talked about most recently that is beyond a stretch by a long shot. So, you take your child to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History or some other renowned museum, and not only do they see these statements that are just presented as fact as if there's no other point of view, meet your ancestors. But what the children learn, and all this is by design, is that evolution can be fun. And so you go into an area of the Smithsonian where this particular wing is dedicated to the development, allegedly, of apes into humans. And you walk along and you see this display and this display, and here's another skeleton and pictures and placards and description, and it's just right there before your very eyes. But then you come on to a photo booth, and you remember the photo booths that, young people would get in and they make funny faces and pay their money and they get a photo. Well, this photo booth lets you choose what kind of ape man you want to be. Do you want to see what you would have looked like 200 million years ago or 500 million years ago? So I was with my daughter and I said, "Come on, get in there and let's see what you look like." "No, Dad, I'm not going to do that." So I had to volunteer to jump in, and here I am. Here I am. And you know what really upset me about this is my daughter thought it was an improvement. But what is the point, really? Let's make evolution fun. And the displays are designed to, number one, make sure every visitor knows God was not involved in any of this. This is all natural. This is how it happened. These are your relatives. And they've pulled out all the stops to take God out of our society. Now, it's not my responsibility tonight, and I haven't been assigned to talk about this, but this is not merely an academic discussion. The fruit of all of this is seen where prayer's taken out of the school. Let's take down the 10 Commandments. We have seen the assault on all things Christian. And now we are living in a world where the fruit of evolution is now coming back to haunt us. And that's a whole nother topic. But let's talk about for a minute evaluating evolution. When these kinds of truth claims are made, like big changes, and we know what they mean by big changes, small steps, it's in the rocks, it's in the fossils. Those kinds of truth claims can be evaluated. And we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about these matters. In evaluating evolution, we have to consider how it allegedly begins, how these small steps are explained to us, and where's the proof. Again, I go back to that statement, big changes, small steps. Completely new living organisms through small steps. Now, the small steps are allegedly natural selection and genetic mutation in terms of the most popular views that are presented today. Now, again, we can talk about the evolution of evolution and the fighting among themselves as these particular ideas about the small steps become more and more incredulous the more we discover about the complexity of life. But these are the popular small steps that supposedly create the big changes. And the proof, again, allegedly found in the fossils, and we need that time. We need that geologic time, as they tell us. Here's how often, whether in textbooks or in some other form, the story of evolution goes. You've heard it before. You've maybe heard it in some kind of National Geographic special or Discovery Channel or something like that. How does it go? Millions of years ago, in a primeval slime, these molecules fortuitously got together and life came into being. Something along those lines. Now, we're never told where the slime comes from, never told where the primeval ocean or whatever it is comes from. We're never told where the molecules come from or how they happen to get together. We're not told any of that. But isn't that a fair question? How did something that's not alive just become alive? That is an extremely, and becoming more and more, an extremely complex question. And yet, if we buy into the theory of evolution, Darwinianism, that is designed to take God out of the equation, we're asked to believe, in addition to all the other unbelievable matters, that life just sprang into being. And then what happened? Well, so that's where they began. They just want to talk about all this stuff is in existence with no explanation, and it just happens, lives. And then they want to start with the small steps. That it just began to transform itself into something it's not. We talked about last night from the pen of evolutionists, from paleontologists who struggle with what's actually in the fossil record with what they believe. And so some of them have postulated other theories that are not Darwinism. Because if there's one thing they have bought into is there is no God. But we read over and over again how they have to acknowledge that statements like, well, Darwinism is evident in the rocks and the fossils, and they say, no, it's not. There are gaps in the fossil record. That doesn't have to do with the distribution of fossils physically where they are on the earth. It has to do with the fact that the missing fossils, or what Darwin called the intermediary fossils, are the ones that are supposed to show us where the big changes happen. The gaps are the missing transitional fossils. So we have every right to question this statement about big changes through small steps. Because if it were true, we should see in the earth, like we're told, millions of transitional fossils. But strangely, the fossil record looks much like the animals that are walking around today. But this is what we are tasked to evaluate. How did it just get alive? How does natural selection, whatever that means, how does that create new complex creatures? How do mutations change something into a higher life form? And by the way, we can't verify this in the fossils, and there's not enough time. So if we back up even to some things we talked about Monday night, we have to ask all of these questions. Where's the evidence for the cosmic egg that was the origin of the universe? Where's the evidence that natural forces like gravity just came into being, laws that are constant, that operate on the physical material world? How did those laws come into being simultaneously and create out of what's supposedly chaos, perfect order? What evidence is there that non-living becomes living? What evidence is there that natural selection creates new kinds of creatures? Or what evidence is there that genetic mutations add genetic material so something becomes something that it's not? These are fair questions. They're unanswered questions that give us every right to, on the one hand, discount something for which there's no evidence, and then on the other hand, see how Genesis 1 actually corresponds to science and reason. And that's where we will head. Listen to this as an evolutionist, the late Robert Jastrow, wrote in his book, Until the Sun Dies. Perhaps the appearance of life on the earth is a miracle. Scientists are reluctant to accept that view, but their choices are limited. Either life was created on the earth by the will of a being outside the grasp of scientific understanding, or it evolved on our planet spontaneously through chemical reactions occurring in non-living matter lying on the surface of the planet. Now, like we began Monday night talking about the origin of the universe, so we can talk about the origin of life as he does, and say, we're really down to two options. Either there's a supernatural force, or it's completely natural. There's either a creator making this happen, or it just happens on its own. And he acknowledges that, right? Those are the two possibilities. Now, here's what he says next. The first theory, that is, God, places the question of the origin of life beyond the reach of scientific inquiry. It's a statement of faith in the power of a supreme being not subject to the laws of science. The second theory, what is that? Just the spontaneous generation of life. The second theory is also an act of faith. The act of faith consists in assuming that the scientific view of the origin of life is correct without having concrete evidence to support that belief. What is he admitting? It's what we believe. But there is no concrete evidence. There has never been an experiment, some kind of study. There has never been any evidence to suggest that something that is not alive could, on its own, become alive. And he admits that. There's no evidence for that. Now, what about the small steps? Again, I'll refer to Dr. Miller's book, chapter 8. He talks about the evolution of evolution. And when Charles Darwin wrote his book in 1859 on the origin of the species, the fuller title is On the Origin of Species Through the Means of Natural Selection. So he contended that natural selection is the mechanism that represents the small steps by which a big change happens. That is, a new living organism changes into something more complex that it was not before. What is natural selection? Well, he said that is the struggle of something to survive, and nature selects what survives and what does not survive. And so the weak are rooted out, and there's the survival of what? Survival of the fittest. And the fittest pass on their good, fit genes to their offspring. And nature then has a way of kind of filtering out the weak, and the strong survive. Here's a very basic example. Let's say there are two separate groups of gazelles that live in the Serengeti on the plains of Africa. This group of gazelles that is completely removed from this group consists of very slow gazelles. And this herd over here seems to be faster. Who do you think will be eaten up first? Well, there you have it. See, the slower ones are going to be more susceptible to the predators. And the faster ones that get away will pass on their genes, and the slower ones are going to die out, and the faster ones. That's at least a very simplistic representation of what this is supposed to be. Now, you remember I keep referring to the evolution of evolution? That was the idea that prevailed out of Darwin's work. That was his theory about how the small steps happen. And so people began to think about that and analyze that and study that. And one evolutionist came along around the turn of the 20th century, and he was studying genetics, and he was studying genetics of plants. He was in this field and studying Darwinism and trying to sort out the mechanics of how things change and become more complex and higher forms of life. And he wrote this. just digest this for a minute. Hugo de Verres wrote in Species and Varieties, natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. He's asking, what about weaker ones being weeded out transforms the surviving ones into something that they're not? And so, though an evolutionist, he said, we've got to evolve the theory because it just doesn't work. And so he and others in the early 1900s began to theorize that mutations combined with natural selection, now that represents how actual evolution, ascending to a higher form of life, takes place. And thus the prevailing view after the 1930s is what is known as neo-Darwinism, and that incorporates the idea of mutations as the mechanism that small steps take place. So we can think about that. What are mutations? First of all, we're talking about something that's rare, most of the time harmful, and here's the most important point. Mutations do not create genetic information. So what do we know now in the DNA era? We know that life, the cell, is much more complex than people ever dreamed of 100 years ago. There was, and you've probably all heard about this, there was an atheist who was one of the leading, writing, debating atheists of the 20th century by the name of Anthony Flew. He debated Thomas B. Warren, member of the church, many years ago on creation and evolution. Dr. Flew published, a little less than 20 years ago, a book entitled, now this is one of the leading atheists of the 20th century. He published a book entitled, There Is a God. And his reason for making the transition from atheism to some sort of belief in God. He didn't become a Christian, he didn't believe in the God of the Bible, but he just said there has to be a creator. His reason for making that transition was the complexity of the cell. So here we are now digging deeper and deeper down into the complexity of life, into the cell. And here is in the center of that cell, DNA. Or as sometimes we think about it, a genetic code. And everyone's DNA is unique, right? Now there's a commonality in terms of if a drop of blood or some other hair follicle or something is analyzed, that's human DNA. But then it's unique to a certain person, like fingerprints are unique to us. So you see the imprint of a human hand, it's a human hand, but the fingerprints say it's unique to a specific person. And DNA, that genetic code, is the manual that says how to make this human being. And at the moment of conception, that manual is written. What color of hair, what color of eyes, what we're going to be like as a full-grown human being. That code is written. And so now with the development of greater understanding about the complexity of life, what we have come to understand is when we talk about life or something being alive, that means there is information. The genetic code is a written in the DNA manual of what we're going to be like and all the processes by which that is going to abide. Now, what is a mutation? A mutation is when something gets scrambled. A mutation is, if you think about it like a book, a mutation is, oh, a line has been left out, so it doesn't quite read right. A word has been misspelled. And normally when we're talking about mutations, we're talking about adverse effects to human beings. Okay, we're not talking about the comic books, right? And some mutant becomes a superhero. Okay, that is the thing of comic books. But in the real world, no parent wants to hear that your child is suffering from a genetic disorder, because that's harmful. Now, here is the important understanding, and again, I highly recommend Dr. Miller's book on science versus evolution. It is just loaded with information. And on this topic, he points out, and quoting from multiple geneticists on this issue, by its very definition, a mutation is simply the scrambling of the information that's already there. Whereas what evolutionists are telling us is that new information is added. So there has to be whole new lines of code, genetic code, or in reality, multiple new volumes of genetic code that just somehow magically appear in a living organism to write that organism to be something that it wasn't before. And this is why there is constantly the evolution of evolution, because the theories of yesterday don't work anymore as the complexity of life is appreciated on a deeper and deeper level. But this is what we've been told since the 30s, and it's even now debated in the evolutionist community. This is how the small steps happen. Mutations. It just sounds so easy and fortuitous. But by definition, it does not create new genetic material, new information. So we don't even have a mechanism that is airtight supporting this theory. But on the other hand, let's evaluate creation. And let's see what we know from real observation of the way the world works. Everything about concrete scientific laws actually syncs with the biblical account of creation. We can talk about some of the most fundamental laws of nature, like the laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics says matter is neither being created or destroyed. There is the conservation of energy. It may change form, but we know of no exception where something just pops into existence. And so something has to come from something else. The first law of thermodynamics points us to the fact that something outside of physical matter is required for its existence. The second law says that things are running down, so in terms of time, there had to be a beginning. There had to be something outside of and before. And who is that? That's God. Those are concrete laws of science concerning which there's no known exception. That leads us to the law of causality. That when we look at things and we think about them, we analyze them, and they're in existence, we're constantly looking for an explanation. You've all seen pictures of the pyramids, right? And maybe some of you have been to Egypt and seen them for yourself. But Here we have these very familiar images. Everybody has seen them. There's been studies done, and it continues to baffle people as to how the Egyptians built these things. There are all kinds of ideas, but it's just astounding to think about the massive stones and the geometry and everything that was done. What if I said to you, well, I've come across what I think is a reasonable explanation for how the pyramids were built. I think there came a sandstorm through Giza, and once that sandstorm blew out, there were the pyramids. Now, why can't that be a reasonable explanation? Because it's not an adequate explanation for what exists. When you see something that has geometric precision, when you see these stones that are carved and fitting together perfectly, you don't have to know exactly what happened, but you know people were involved. If you're walking along the beach and you see written into the sand, hello, you don't have to be a scientist to know somebody was there and wrote hello. That's a word, that's information, that's communication, it's language, it is symbols that represent. That didn't just happen. And the world is a whole lot more complex than hello. The law of causality says everything that we know and experience has to have an adequate cause. Just throwing out some crazy idea is irrational. And the world that we observe, the physical universe, the human body, the cell, what is an adequate cause for that effect or the existence of it? Well, the Bible answers that question, and reason demands it. And so again, Genesis and the biblical account of creation actually correspond to reason and known scientific law. We talk about the law of biogenesis, again, of which there's no known exception. The law of biogenesis says that life comes from life, and there is no exception. Furthermore, the law of biogenesis identifies the fact that not any life comes from any life. That is, life comes from like kind of life. How many times in Genesis 1 do we read something like this? God brought forth the trees, and they'll produce after their kind. And he brought forth the animals, and they'll produce after their kind. That actually agrees with everything we know about the law of biogenesis. First, life comes from life, and that of its kind. There are no known exceptions to that, because there are none. And then when we turn back for just a second to the fields of geology and paleontology, we look into the rocks, we look at the fossils, we don't find what we're told we're supposed to find. Rather, what we find is something that is more consistent with a worldwide catastrophe that the Bible describes as the flood. So we talked about briefly last night the fossil graveyards, the polystrate fossils, ephemeral markings, preservation of soft tissue, all kinds of characteristics in the fossil record that say, hey, all this stuff was buried really fast, otherwise it would have decomposed. And other traits identify for us with the lack of transitional fossils that the record in the earth actually fits the record of the Bible. And that leads us to look in the mirror. The study of mankind. There are unique things about human beings that are in and of themselves evidence for creation. In other words, the Bible says that man and woman, human beings, are unique among all living beings. And you and I know that to be true. So we can look in the mirror and thinking about that, we can consider the following. The Genesis record makes this statement that man was made on the sixth day. We're going to talk about how this fits real observation, how the Bible fits perfectly. The record, the biblical account says we were made on the sixth day. And notice the confirmation of passages found elsewhere in the Bible. It won't do to just say, well, Genesis is figurative. Let's set that aside and not take it seriously. When you have passages like Exodus 20 and verse 11, where based upon the work week, that is the original work week, just like God worked 6 days and rested the seventh, that was then the law given through Moses to the Israelites to observe the Sabbath. Work 6, rest on the Sabbath. For in 6 days God created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Everything in that original work week. Jesus confirms this, and we made this point earlier in the week, that he says, God made them male and female from the beginning of the creation. You cannot separate the creation of the earth from the creation of mankind by billions of years and take the words of Jesus at face value. Jesus puts the creation of man and woman at the beginning, not at the end. Romans 1:20 again says that God has been perceived through the things that are made since the creation. That again is the consistent emphasis of Scripture, that man goes back to the creation week. So we have confirmation in other passages of exactly what Genesis 1 says about the creation of everything in those 6 days. Think about this. Man is made from the dust. You remember that in Genesis 2 and verse 7? God made man from the what? Dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. You cannot take that passage seriously if you believe God took some type of ape creature and made it human, as do some who try to have it both ways and merge together evolution with the Bible. God did not make man out of some pre-existing animal, but he made him unique and then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Now look at the corresponding passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 47. Paul says, the first man is from the earth, corresponding exactly to what Moses said. Think about this. Genesis 1:27, God made them male and female, made them unique, distinct. And Jesus says the same thing. The biblical record is this, that God created Adam and then created Eve out of Adam. Now, what does the New Testament say? It says the very same thing. And my point is, you just can't set Genesis 1 aside and say, well, this is a beautiful poem, but don't take the details seriously. The biblical account of creation, confirmed by New Testament passages, is that God created everything in 6 days, made man from the dust, not from a pre-existing animal, made them male and female, and made man and woman out of man by a miracle, and then made in God's image. And that leads us back to this question about the uniqueness of human beings. Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist we've referred to 2 or 3 times, wrote this in a book called River Out of Eden. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, others are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, he's right about one thing. If there is no God, there is no good or evil. And let's just focus in the few minutes we have remaining on how absolutely unique human beings really are. So unique that there's absolutely no explanation for it other than the fact that they are made in the image of God. We could talk at length about a number of characteristics that derive from being made in the image of God, like the capacity to love and choose and feel right and wrong. That is unique and powerful. Let's just focus on that with a basic argument. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But clearly, undeniably, universally, objective moral values and duties exist. Therefore, God exists. That is, I'm saying, if we look in the mirror and we see how we're made, and we are so unique among all living things that we have a feeling of moral obligation that testifies that we have been programmed to think and to feel a certain way. And this is not just characteristic of some human beings. This is characteristic of the human race and has been from the beginning. Let's just make a couple of points that are so self-evident but remind us of how unique human beings are. The existence of moral prescriptions is a fascinating trait that is unique to us. What is a moral prescription? Well, it is saying of contemplated future events, this is what you ought to do or not do. That we have such a sensitivity about right and wrong that we anticipate things that have never even happened and weigh in on what should or should not be. That's not just me or you, that's humanity. Who would dispute this moral prescription? Children ought not to be hurt. Now, there are a few psychopaths out there in the world, and we all know that. But they are outliers. Most people, no matter where they are or who they are or when they live, believe we ought to protect our children. Children ought not to be harmed. And that is a moral feeling for which there is no explanation in Darwinism, because in Darwinism, hey, the fit survive. There's no right or wrong. It's tooth and claw. But that's not the world we really live in. We live in a world of moral prescriptions about what ought or ought not to be. And then there is the irreversible and instantaneous moral judgments we have about past actions. To even talk about justice is to say there has been wrong committed. And so whether we're talking about the past, the future, or even our own selves, we have a deep sense of morality that is evidence that all of us are running the same moral software. And where did that come from? That came from our Creator, who made us in His image. What I'm saying is observations about our own makeup point us back to what Genesis said. All the details of Genesis line up with what we see and observe in the world. And so the biblical record of creation syncs with real observation in the world. Thank you so much for your kind attention, your encouragement. It's been a blessing for me to be with you, and I can't thank you enough for this opportunity.